Hello and welcome. Good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. My name is Andreas Rechtkemmer. I have the pleasure and the honor of welcoming you on behalf of the College of Public Policy at Hamad bin Khalifa University and to guide you through the event today, our seminar on the COVID-19 policy tracker on MENA government responses to the crisis. First of all, I would like to share our agenda with you for today. After this short introduction, after this short opening, and a few housekeeping rules for the webinar, I will hand over to our first presenter, Dr. Leslie Paul, Dean of the College of Public Policy, who will talk about our methodology for the tracker. And also then the next speaker will be Dr. Omar Al-Bagha, who is a professor of genomic and precision medicine at the College of Health and Life Sciences here at HBKU, who will talk about causes and variations in the number of cases and severity of symptoms of COVID-19. We will then open the floor for a first round of questions, answers, discussion, and in a moment I will tell you how that works. After that first round of Q&A, we will introduce to you the policy measures, government response measures that we have tracked in this project and mapped out and analyzed, starting with public health measures introduced by myself, also as lead principal investigator of the project. I will then hand over to my colleague, Dr. Özkan Özgürtürk, who is also a principal investigator and will speak on economic and fiscal policy measures, followed by Dr. Anis Ben Brik, who is also a principal investigator, and both gentlemen are professors in the College of Public Policy too, who will speak then about social policy measures. After that, we'll do a second, a little bit longer round of Q&A and discussion, and then wrap up the webinar for you. Our next speaker is Founding Dean Dr. Leslie Paul, Founding Dean of the College of Public Policy here at HBKU, and a very well-known and a very senior scholar in the policy sciences with lots of experience in public policy science and comparative public policy methodology. Fantastic today to guide us into the methodological area of our research, of this kind of research. And without further ado, Dr. Les, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Andreas. So it's a great honor and a pleasure to be part of this project, and it's wonderful to get to this point where we're sharing the results, the preliminary results. I've been asked to provide an overview of tracking public policy, of how we try to capture policy, and I'm not going to get into deep methodological issues. That's not appropriate at this point, but I did want to provide a kind of tour d'horizon of the different ways in which recently, over the last 15 or 20 years, there have been increasing and more sophisticated attempts to try to capture the content and the impact and effect and outcomes of public policy. Next slide, please. So I'm going to run through a number of examples and just try to give you a flavor for some of the methodological challenges, and then end with a few observations about the particular challenges in doing a policy tracker of the sort that my colleagues primarily and myself secondarily have been working on over the last number of months. This is one of the most visible and well-known policy indicators or indices at the international level. It originally came out of the World Bank. It's the Worldwide Governance Indicators. It's been going for a number of years, since 1996, and now has data on 200 countries. When you think about it, how do you try to capture the quality or the nature of governance in a particular country? This particular index uses 6 different dimensions: voice and accountability, political stability and absence of violence, government effectiveness across a whole range of public policy areas, regulatory quality, rule of law, and control of corruption. and it uses over 30 different data sets or databases to develop indices in each one of those 6 areas. This is extremely sophisticated and obviously very high level in terms of trying to capture governance in all of these 6 dimensions for over 200 countries. Next slide, please. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of somewhat apparently simpler types of indices or policy metrics. The first one is by Freedom House, again, quite well known internationally as an attempt to capture the nature of freedom. And again, we could have an interesting discussion another time about what that actually means. But Freedom House is an American-based NGO operating since about 1946, I believe. And one of its most famous products is this world map of freedom. And it has different dimensions, as you can roughly make out. Countries that are in the green zone are considered to be free. Those that are in the yellow or tan zone are considered to be partly free, and those that are in the purple zone are considered to be not free. This is quite crude and, again, debatable, but it's an attempt and a way of capturing a phenomenon, a governance phenomenon at the global level. Next slide, please. Here's another very famous one. This was put out by Transparency International. The Corruption Perceptions Index, whereas the previous one, the Freedom in the World, is primarily based on documentary evidence and interviews with experts who then assess or rate countries. The Corruption Perceptions Index is essentially based on what people feel in their respective countries or think the nature or level of corruption is. And again, you have a dispersion of countries here across the globe. The darker the red color, the more corrupt the perceptions are, or the perceptions are of corruption in that particular country. The lighter colored countries are considered to be less corrupt, at least in terms of the perceptions that their respective populations have. Next slide, please. So each one of these, the freedom, if I could have the next slide, please. The Freedom in the World, the Corruption Perceptions Index, the Global Governance Index, these are all attempts at capturing single snapshots of a single, well, in the case of the governance indicators, it's 6 different dimensions. In terms of freedom, it's 1 dimension, freedom and accountability. In terms of corruption, it's just the Corruption Perceptions Index. Again, if I could ask for the next slide, Mr. Ezzedine. Thank you. Here's one that's a little bit more complicated. This is put out by the OECD, and it's the Program for International Student Assessment that measures performance of students in reading, mathematics, and thinking skills right around the world. It has now, I believe, about 57 countries participating. And you'll see here there's an attempt at getting or capturing a little bit of causality. This particular slide shows a relationship between reading scores, which are up on the left-hand axis going vertically, and then the expenditures on education, cumulative expenditures per student along the horizontal axis at the bottom. And you'll see that while there is appears to be along the curve here a relationship between spending and educational outcomes, it's not perfect. And then if we click one more time, Mr. Ezzedine, you'll see that Qatar is circled there in red. No, please go back and just remain on that slide. One more, please. Yes, stop. You'll see that Qatar, if you can click again, there. Qatar is actually has an outsized expenditure per student, but its results are lower than countries that spend less money but have higher outcomes. Now, whether that is a valid conclusion and what the reasons behind that are certainly debatable and would need investigation. But this kind of snapshot at least begins the conversation about these potentially causal relationships. Now the next slide, please, Mr. Ezzedine. Thank you. Here's 2 other ways in which we can try to capture the multidimensionality of policy. On the left, on the first part of this slide, you see what's called a spider chart. And again, this is put out by the OECD. It's an attempt at a multidimensional policy and institutions coherence migration policy. So here the attempt is to map for a particular country against the OECD average 5 different dimensions in migration policy: institutional coherence, migration, migrants' rights, migrants' reintegration, and the development impact. So if we had a different set of countries shown in the blue, you would have a different distribution of scores across those 5 dimensions. And you'd also have an almost immediate benchmarking against the OECD average. So these kinds of spider web dashboards, if you call them that, are a way of capturing multidimensionality of a particular policy area, in this case, migration policy, and giving you immediate visual rendering of comparisons with the OECD average. One more click, please, Mr. Ezzedine. The next graphic shows you what's called a traffic light representation or visualization. Once again, we have the 5 different dimensions of migration policy: institutional coherence, reducing costs, migrants' rights, reintegration, and development. And you could see how you could provide a crude measure of green, yellow, and red being a warning sign or difficulty. And this gives you an immediate visual representation across a variety of countries. So just looking at this, glancing at this, you would have an immediate perception that country C is in some difficulty. It has 3 areas that are in the red zone in comparison to country A that has 1. Country B seems to be the best of the 3. It only has 2 yellows, but 3 green. So these are ways of capturing, again, multidimensionality in a visualized format to try to give you a sense of policy. Next slide, please. So these are, if we look at trackers, the difference between trackers, and this is a characteristic of the MENA policy tracker, is that rather than providing snapshots, which most of the previous slides did, a snapshot of the multidimensionality of migration policy, a snapshot of governance, a snapshot of corruptions, a snapshot of freedom, the thing about a tracker is that it actually tries to measure over time performance in a policy area. And again, I'm just providing a couple of examples. Here's a climate action tracker, which is put out to track all countries' emission reduction pledges and their implementation according to the Paris Climate Change Accord. So as it says here in the slide, its assessments are regarded as a thermometer of international climate action ambition. So this is meant to be snapshots over time to track the fidelity of countries to their commitments under the Paris agreements. So a tracker is multidimensional and it takes place over time to try to capture the evolution of policy initiatives in a particular field. Next click or next graphic, please. This one provides an even better example. This is put out by the Council on Foreign Relations, and it's a global monetary policy tracker. Monetary policy, of course, being primarily the interest rates that are decided upon by central banks. And interest rates, if they rise, are tight. They tighten the money, indicate a tighter monetary policy. If they're loosened, they indicate a more flexible or easing monetary policy. And here you have at the very top of this graphic, again, over time and measured against easing or tightening, the overall global trend in monetary policy. And then there's a visual representation below of showing different countries around the world. Again, the attempt in a tracker is to try to capture the multidimensionality of a particular policy area and measure it across time. And now my last slide, please, Mr. Ezzedine. Oh, there it is. So what is the challenge of a COVID policy tracker? And my colleagues will explore some of these challenges and show you how they overcame them. But let me run through a few of them. As I mentioned, a tracker is, as the name or word implies, it follows, it tracks policy over time. Now, the problem or the challenge with COVID, of course, is that now we're now many months into it, but still, when you think about it, essentially, the impact of the pandemic really began to be evident in January or February and accelerating dramatically as of March. And we're still trying to see what the responses were month by month, but even down to the point of day by day. So we have real time, something that's happening very, very quickly, that's happening globally. In our case, we're looking at a particular region. And it's an evolving policy challenge because the nature of the pandemic, as we'll hear from Dr. Omar, is still, we're still wrestling to understand it. So it's real time, evolving, and challenging and rapid because of that. It has multiple sectors. The obvious ones are health, education, and social protection. They're the major ones that will be dealt with by my colleagues. But there are other sectors, less obvious sectors of policy that also have been affected, like migration and entry and exit provisions, security issues and privacy, all the way to trade and the economic impacts. So tracking COVID and the policy responses to COVID and the pandemic are particularly challenging. And I'm happy to say that my colleagues rose to that set of challenges brilliantly, as you will hear in their presentations after we hear from Dr. Omar. So thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Les. And I would just like to remind everyone in the audience, so please formulate your questions, direct them to Dr. Les in this case, or if you have a more generic question, use the Q&A chat function and start please typing your questions now. Thank you very much. And with that, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Omar Al-Bagha, who is a senior professor of genomic and precision medicine at our sister College of Health and Life Sciences at Hamad bin Khalifa University here in Doha, and who is an expert in genetics, genome sequencing, and has been involved also in the Qatar Genome Project. Dr. Omar, it's our pleasure to welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Andreas. It's my pleasure to participate in this webinar. So in this talk, I will be talking about the causes of variations in the number of cases and the symptoms of COVID-19. As we know now, the pandemic has spread all over the world with over 40 million reported cases so far, and just over 1 million deaths due to this viral disease. The slide here shows the number of reported cases reported across the world, and the color indicates the darker the red color indicates the higher the cases reported by the country. As you can see, there is a clear difference in the number of reported cases across the globe. We see, for example, the UK, the Western Europe, like Spain, France, they reported high number of cases compared to places such as countries in the African continent. And the slide here shows the number of reported cases focusing on the Middle East region. The green bars represent the number of cases reported across the time since the pandemic started back in January, and the dark black line indicates the number of reported deaths. You can see during the first peak of the pandemic, we saw a sharp increase in both the number of reported cases across the Middle Eastern countries, as well as increase in the number of reported deaths. This is followed by a reduction later during July and August, but we're witnessing an increase in the number of cases again, what will look like a second wave as what we are seeing in other countries across the world. What we also see, there is also a difference in the distribution of cases by age. So the slide here shows, again, across the time of the pandemic, the age group of people with positive tests for COVID-19. You can see those in the age group between 25 to 64 represent the highest number of cases, accounting for about 65% of cases, followed by those between the age of 65 and 84 years old. Young people below the age of 14 are less likely to be reported as positive, accounting for less than around 3% of the total reported cases. So what causes these variations in the number of cases between the different populations and the different countries? Some of the factors that can contribute to this are listed in this slide. So I will talk about some of these. This is not an extensive list. The first one can be attributed to the number of tests. Some government chose to employ like an extensive testing and tracking strategy at the beginning of the pandemic. So obviously, the larger the number of tests performed, the more likely you will pick up the positive cases. And this is varies between the different populations and the different countries. The next reason can be attributed to demographic differences, for example, population age composition. We saw in the previous slides that the disease does not affect all the age groups in the same way. So, for example, countries with a younger age composition are less likely to report the same number of cases compared to those with the higher age or higher average age. For example, the African continent population is much younger, and they do indeed reported less number of cases compared to, for example, European countries. There is also social differences between the countries. For example, adherence to the social distancing rules, which we know it varies between different populations. And again, government's response measures, which will be talked about later in this talk by my colleagues. For example, the timing and the extent of lockdown can dramatically impact the spread of the virus and ultimately affect the number of cases reported by each country. When it comes to the variation in the number of deaths, many factors can contribute to this variation, including the socio-demographic characteristics of the population. Again, for example, the age. We know older people are more likely to suffer severe form of the disease and are more likely to die from it. Resilience and effectiveness of the healthcare systems can also account to the number of deaths from this disease. Governments with an effective healthcare system can cope with the number of cases, providing efficient healthcare system and reducing the number of deaths. Again, timing and extent of government response can also affect the number of deaths. And finally, differences in the genetic makeup between populations can also affect the number of deaths, as we will discuss in the next few slides. So we know now there is a great variation in the symptoms of COVID-19 between individuals. So now we know about 80% of people who test positive for the disease have mild symptoms, ranging from mild fever, cough, loss of the sense of smell and the sense of taste, to flu-like symptoms. Most of these cases do not require hospitalization and can be managed at home. However, we see 15% of the cases suffer from severe symptoms that require medical attention, and 5% requires that have critical conditions that require, for example, intensive care treatment. These variation in the symptoms of the disease, again, can be attributed to many factors. This is just, I will mention few of them. For example, again, the age and the sex of the patient can play a factor. The older the patient, the more likely to have severe symptoms. And we know there is evidence that males are more likely to suffer severe symptoms compared to females. Similarly, people with pre-existing medical conditions such as diabetes, heart disease, kidney and lung problems are more likely to suffer from severe symptoms and requiring medical treatment and medical attention and hospitalization. And finally, genetic makeup of the individual also contribute to this variation in the symptoms of the disease. There are mainly two ways by which genetic makeup can affect the severity or the differences in the symptoms of the disease. The first one is to do with differences in genes associated with disease susceptibility. We know now that the coronavirus, which is shown here in this cartoon, requires certain proteins that are expressed in our cells, in the lung, for example. And the virus uses these proteins as a way to gain access to the cells. And once they go inside the cell, they hijack the cell machinery, and they use the cell to copy themselves, and this will result in the production of a large number of new viruses that will again go and infect new, more healthy cells, and the cycle can go on. So genetic variations that can lead to differences in the shape or the number of these proteins can either enhance the ability of the virus to gain access or reduce its ability to gain access to our cells, resulting in either more severe illness or less. The second mechanism by which genes can contribute to the variation in the severity of the symptoms is through genetic variations that control our immune response. As you know, our immune system is responsible for defending our body against viruses, parasites, and bacteria. And the effectiveness of our immune system is determined by our genetic makeup. Some individuals have genetic makeup allowing them to have a very efficient immune system that will fight the virus efficiently, resulting in less severe form of the disease. Whereas other people with certain genetic makeup may have a less effective immune system, resulting in a more severe disease. We have conducted a pilot study here in Qatar looking at genetic variations in genes that are potentially have a link to SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus responsible for COVID-19, and we compared it to different populations. So this study was done in collaboration with Qatar University and Qatar Genome Project. So we looked at genetic variation across 11 genes that are linked to COVID-19, either infection susceptibility or to our immune system, so our response to the virus. What we noticed that the Qatari population has a higher frequency of genetic variants compared to European population shown in the blue bars here. Even when we compared our data to the East Asian population shown in the green part here, we have higher frequency of genetic variations that are related to disease susceptibility. And this may partially explain why we have large number of cases per capita in Qatar. Or conversely, when we looked at genes that are responsible for severity, those that are related to our immune response, we saw the opposite. So the number of or the frequency of these genetic variations were much lower in the Qatari population compared to both to the European population or the East Asian population. And again, this may contribute to the observation that we found in Qatar, where the number of deaths per positive cases is much lower than other populations. Final slide here shows we compared the frequency of all these genes across the 5 different populations: the European, East Asian, South Asian, this is the Qatari population in the middle, the African population, and the American population. And we saw marked differences in the frequency distribution for these genes. And one of the observations we found is that the African population seems to have the lowest number of genetic variants with linked to disease susceptibility. Finally, obviously, this is a pilot study. Larger, more comprehensive studies are required to define the genetic contribution to susceptibility and severity of this pandemic disease. And thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so very much, Dr. Omar. First of all, I would like to ask you in the audience, our dear participants, to pose your questions. Use the chat Q&A function to ask your questions and let us know who you are directing your question to. Now, we have a first question here, and I believe this is for Dr. Les. The question is, and that relates to the PISA study, the outcomes. Why does Qatar have such a high spending and such a low performance? What are the reasons?
I would actually reframe the question. I mean, what are the range of factors that are related with educational performance? That one slide just showed expenditure. So I'm not trying to dodge the question, but you would want to have a beginning of a conversation, an analysis of class size, of teacher qualifications, teacher training, and variety of population, etc. So, and specifically in the Qatari case, the expenditures on infrastructure are very high because they've been invested very quickly over the last number of years. So that those costs are disproportionate possibly to the costs for other countries that already have made those investments in a previous period. So these kinds of snapshots need to be looked at very, very carefully because there's a whole set of questions underpinning them about what the factors are that actually lead to different levels of performance.
Thank you very much. And the second question also for you, Dr. Les. Someone is asking how we have met, or how one meets in general, doing these things, the tracking and the performance indicators, meets the challenges of making sure one uses reliable evidence bases, particularly in the MENA region. So how do we ensure reliability of data?
For the data itself, you're looking for credible sources of data to the greatest extent possible. So international organizations, many countries are producing, for example, healthcare statistics that are bound to international standards and reporting requirements. So the first general intent is to try to ensure that the sources of the information are as credible as possible. So international organizations, as I said, ministries of government that have responsibilities for reporting to international organizations, and moving out from there to credible NGOs that are themselves monitoring government performance, and media, again, much more carefully because the media reports on government policy announcements will often tend to be fairly superficial. So you need to adopt a strategy of triangulation to try to develop a range of different data sources to ensure their credibility and their robustness. It's a whole other question when you get into trying to convert those data sources into indices of, say, freedom or good governance or corruption. And that's a topic to go into because it's too complicated for this presentation, and we do want to focus on COVID.
Thank you. If you allow me to, there's one follow-on question, though, which is asking specifically about governance. The person names it, calls it governance, contexts of governance, which are not transparent. In other words, governments that are known not to be really transparent about the data. So is there a specific strategy to still make sure we get reliable information?
Oh, you're posing the question rather than answering it. Okay, I thought you were going to be answering it. For countries that produce less reliable information, again, it's simply a matter of trying to triangulate as best as possible from a variety of different sources, and trying to get the best that you can do under those circumstances. these different global indices that I was mentioning, like the WGI, the World Governance Index, of Freedom House, they adopt different strategies. So Freedom House, to deal with countries that are obviously less free, tries to combine documentary evidence with assessments by experts, some of which are in country and some of which are outside of country. So you can try to get around some of the limitations of data by trying to consult experts or those knowledgeable in particular areas of governance that you're interested in.
This is simply about the reported cases that you mentioned on one of your slides. Is the source of those reported cases from our project, the MENA Tracker project, or where did you get them from?
These actually were taken from the World Health Organization website, so from the latest report deposited in the World Health Organization.
There is another question for you, Dr. Omar. This is about the representation of cases across age groups. Is there a clinical or other reason for selection of cutoff points? Specifically, the range of 25 to 64-year-olds looks alarmingly high until we consider that it is a larger range than the other ranges.
Again, this is actually the reporting adopted by WHO, and I think it is to do with the classifying the like the individual in the society into those in the working group, so between 25 and 64, those are in the working group, and those younger mostly will be students between the age below the age of 25. And the higher age class, which is above 64, those maybe who are, not in a current working group. So there is a particular, I think, reason. That's maybe the main reason that WHO chose to classify them. However, there are more studies now looking at more classes within this large 25 to 64 group. But ultimately, it goes back to the two factors, basically the general health of the individual. The older the individual, the less likely to be, in full healthy condition, and their immune system is less likely to be as strong as those with the younger age group.
We will tend again to questions after the next three presentations. So I would like to encourage everybody to continue typing in your questions. We will all make sure that we will all address them. We're moving on now to the results actually from the PTGR or MENAtracker.org project. Starting with public health responses, and that is being presented by myself, Andreas Rechkemer. I am a professor in the College of Public Policy, and my focus is on global policy, governance, and international organization. So this is about the public health policy responses in the MENA region. First of all, just a reminder, our project, it's still continuing. It is looking at 10 selected countries in the Middle East and North Africa, MENA. We have the 6 Gulf countries, simply because we are based here out of Doha. And then we have one country from the Maghreb region, Morocco. We have one other Northern African country, Egypt. And we have Jordan and Lebanon from the Levantine region. The PTGR, as we heard from Dr. Less, is in a solid tradition of governance and policy indicators and trackers. The outcome of our project is a tailored data set, first and foremost to advise policymakers, inform decision-making, but of course also provide insight, both to academics and the general public, into policies and measures. And offer a platform for continued real-time tracking. So we are definitely geared up to continue the tracking exercise and well into 2021. I would like to acknowledge once again that this project has been funded very generously by Qatar National Research Fund, QNRF, for its first phase. Next slide, please. So this again is the regional map. Just a quick disclaimer, there is no unified general definition for MENA, which may be surprising to a number of people. As a scholar of international relations, this is the only case where you find, I want to tell you that we have found this to be the only case that is really a little bit not contested, but there are variations of who considers which country to be part of MENA. We simply follow the OECD definition. The OECD mentions 19 countries as part of the MENA region, and we, as I said before, decided to pick those 10. Next slide, please. So basically, we have been doing the tracking on a very rigorous mapping protocol, which we carried out in those 10 countries on a daily basis, day-by-day, real-time tracking, and looking at a variety of reliable data sources. To come back to this question, so we've used a number of data sets from international organizations, including the UN Secretariat, including UNDP, including the ILO, WHO, and especially, of course, the UN Regional Commission, ESCWA, for our region. We also looked at various academic tracking sites. Johns Hopkins is well known by now, but also the Blavatnik School for Public Policy at Oxford University. And we also looked at some peer-reviewed publications that are already available, and to some very, very selected media outlets that are considered reliable. That can be a little bit tricky, but we decided on a very rigorous approach to those sources. For instance, if you take the New York Times or the Washington Post, usually for the American context, these would be considered reliable data sources. And we have tried to do this across the board, but first and foremost, looking at the international organizations' sites. We also looked at data from government websites, official government communications from those countries, websites, news reports, and official Twitter handles as well. This is the protocol also that the WHO uses. We follow that WHO protocol. We do not second guess the accuracy or transparency of, the accuracy in this case, of government numbers as far as they are reported to the WHO and vetted by the WHO in Geneva according to the WHO standards. But we juxtapose those reports with other sources like the ones from the IMF, the OECD, Johns Hopkins, or Oxford. So that has led us to a variety of conclusions that we have tried to analyze in terms of time lines. We see here the 10 countries in terms of the overall number of measures taken in the 3 sectors of public health, economic policy, and social policy, where you can see, of course, all of the countries started somewhere in early March, but you have a huge amount of initial responses, for instance, in the UAE and in Jordan, while you have fewer responses just in terms of numbers of measures taken, policy measures taken in Oman or Kuwait or other countries. Next slide, please. This is a stacked area graph where we are looking at the beginning sometime in February, now through October 1st. We have included data all the way through September 30th in this graph. That's why you see at the end the graphs coming down. That doesn't mean that they stopped doing things. It's just that we stopped at the end of September in counting new measures. And we will continue to do that and update those graphics. So what you can see here is basically that countries have more or less followed a similar approach to devising public policy responses and measures. Most of them being regulatory, and I'll get back to this in a moment, but also this includes stimulus packages, tax breaks, etc., and some subsidies and social services provided. So these are all the measures, and you can see that looking at the 10 countries, there have been huge variations in terms of the packages, the amount of measures taken. Next slide, please. And then what we did is also to make sure that we can compare the countries. So here you can see the 10 countries. First of all, the dots represent policies and measures officially taken by governments in those countries. And you can immediately intuitively see two things here. The amount of measures and packages undertaken by those governments varies greatly. Countries, the one country that has the most measures in place to tackle COVID-19 is UAE. Qatar is also very comprehensive, so are Egypt and Morocco. Surprisingly, maybe to some, a little less in terms of the numbers by Saudi Arabia. What you can also see here, yellow is for the economic side, blue is for the public health side, and then we have the green for the social side. So that's quite interesting because you see that, for instance, the UAE has put a lot of emphasis on public health measures, and I'll get to this in a moment, what that means, but that includes the lockdowns, the restrictions, the stringency or rigor in imposing barriers to the spread of the virus, while that has seemingly not been or at least the immediate top priority in other countries. In Qatar, Qatar has had the most predominant focus on economic measures and economic recovery. So that's quite interesting. And so from that, we can see how governments appear to have weighted their responses in terms of priorities. And I'll speak to that again in a moment. So that is basically another representation where we have the bubble size of all the countries. This is just for illustration. Everything is on our website. Most of that stuff is interactive. So when you click on those bubbles, you get new images and you can zoom in nicely. So I don't have to take you to all the countries here because that's really on the website and we wouldn't have the time today. But just as a snapshot here for our tracking and mapping, again, the country with the largest bubble is UAE in this case. Morocco, I think, has the second largest bubble. But then if you look at the measures actually of UAE, really by far the most measures in the public health field, whereas Qatar just underneath has the largest bubble in terms of economy. And so here we can see the total amount of measures, but also how they have been weighted across those 10 countries. This is just another representation, another type of graph. What we see here across the 10 countries, now here in alphabetical order. Blue is for public health in this case. So basically we see a variation. That's the percentage, right? This is not the absolute numbers. It's a different representation. So whatever the amount of measures taken by governments so far until now, policy measures, we see all the measures are represented at 100%. The percentage of public health is the highest in almost all cases except for Qatar. And it ranges across the countries between 50 and 70%. The second most represented sector is the economy. Again, here Qatar overwhelmingly the highest percentage of almost 40%. And then the country with the most social responses in the social field is Kuwait, and with the least responses in the social area, Qatar. So these are some interesting insights from our exercise net. These are the total measures over time, and what we can see is obviously the arrival of the virus in the region. The measures started to peak exponentially in early March. And throughout the month of March. This is when all of the countries imposed more or less rigorous and hard lockdowns, movement restrictions, etc., but also started immediate economic measures and in a number of cases also social measures. Since April 1st, the picture has been somewhat steady, with an year of ups and downs, but nowhere near the first peak. So this is for economic measures. Again, mid-March, we had a huge spike here, and Dr. Özkan will tell us what that was all about. Then a few minor spikes, and to someone like me who is a political scientist, not an economist, it's somewhat surprising that since June, actually, really, there hasn't been much on the economic side. And we'll hear from Dr. Özkan why that's the case. Somewhat similar in the social sphere. So a first spike mid-March, simultaneously the though not as extensive or intense. A few more in April, but then it has been relatively silent or even spotty for the rest of the time, and we'll hear from Dr. Anis why that's the case and why that is probably a cause for concern. This is my area, public health, and here it's different. See, again, that spike in the middle of March together with the other two spikes, but it's more broad and diverse. Then in the region here, the public health measures have been relatively stable all the way through the end of June. Now, starting July 1st, this is when most of the MENA countries reverted back to the status quo ante in favor for the most part, but they started to relax the restrictions. We have seen now new measures being taken. And if you take the upper spikes here, you see there is a vector going up. So we are seeing more and more new public health measures being taken by governments, and that coincides possibly a correlation it coincides with the rising numbers again in the region since August. So basically, public health measures obviously are front and center in any epidemic or pandemic situation. We have seen that before. This is not the first pandemic, but it is the most severe by far in the last 100 years at least, maybe even more. Personally, I've done research also on SARS-1, on Ebola, on H1N1, and other avian influenza strains. And so this repertoire of public health policies and measures is something that hasn't been really invented from scratch now in this case. Luckily, because some of those measures, or most of those measures, have been tested before and they are evidence-based. And that's why they are so universal. And the response by governments in terms of the type of measures taken in the public health field have been relatively unified. It's different for the rigor or the intensity and effectiveness, but the type of measures are relatively similar because we do know what actually works in terms of tackling a viral outbreak like this one, at least what works in principle. So the more comprehensive effective, and I should say successful, a country's public health measures are, of course, the less comprehensive the economic and social measures usually have to be, right? Because if a country is successful in the infection, and like New Zealand did now twice, basically getting in control over the virus, of course, they're in a lucky situation afterwards because they don't have to spend too much on stimulus and economic recovery, and also money on mitigating the social impact. So while public health measures are primarily targeting the epidemic or pandemic as such, economic and social measures are typically accompanying measures to limit the damage and the impact in the realm. Obviously, those measures in the public health field have to be evidence-based and follow the international gold standard. The WHO is the international specialized agencies of the United Nations to deal with advice, assessment, so data collection, but also providing advice to governments in terms of this gold standard and the evidence base for measures. But there are also a number of national research centers and institutes like Louis Pasteur in France, or Charité in Berlin, in Germany, Imperial College, Oxford University in the UK, the CDC in the US, and so on and so forth. These measures, however, should be resilience-oriented, which means they should not just look at mitigating viral outbreaks in the first place, but also adding more resilience to societies and countries by prevention. And that is a weak spot in many cases where the preventative measures taken in the past or after strains of avian influenza, etc., that has been less the case. And so those countries now have struggled because they were really not very well prepared to meet this. So that means those countries, all of the countries, UN member states, countries on the planet are called upon to develop comprehensive national emergency and action plans, put them in place so that those can quickly be activated in the case of any new epidemic or pandemic, similar to the standards of disaster risk reduction. So basically, those public health they are there to either mitigate or contain or control a pandemic. The best outcome is control. And that is unfortunately quite rare so far here regarding COVID-19. I mentioned New Zealand. A few other countries have been successful in really controlling the virus sustainably over time. Most countries try to contain, to prevent further community outbreaks and keep a certain level of status quo. That's suboptimal, but in many cases, if not most cases, realistically, the best chance those countries have. Simple mitigation strategies do not seem to be effective in the long run.
Hello, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. So my name is Özkan. I'm an assistant professor of economics in the College of Public Policy at HBKU, Ahmet Bin Khalifa University. I will be talking about economic policy measures taken to combat with COVID-19 in the MENA region. Next slide, please. So the economic consequences of COVID-19 in Middle Eastern countries has been drastic. We have seen simultaneous shocks that include sharp price decline in oil production and oil prices due to low demand, and we've seen drop in domestic and international demand and reduction in trade, and reduction in tourism revenues, remittances, and foreign direct investments, which are main economic drivers of oil importing countries. And the impact of COVID-19 has become have varied by countries. Oil exporting countries take the biggest hits from the fall in oil prices, whereas oil importing countries they also see decreases in their GDP due to investment, decrease in the investment in the region, to decrease the drop in tourism revenues, remittances, and private consumption that have been dropping significantly in the region. Next slide, please. So, if we take a closer look at the oil price fluctuations over the past year, as we can see, oil price, so in just before COVID-19, the price per barrel was around $70 per barrel. Right after the break, we see a sharp decline until March, and it's around like $20 per barrel. And right after that, like slowly we see a recovery starting from June. We have seen a stable price. This, as we know, the OPEC countries' agreement and some sort of improvement in the market expectation as economies started reopening, we see some stability in the prices. This have covered half of the losses since early 2019, but it's still far below pre-COVID-19 levels, right? So this has, of course, this huge price decrease falls has a significant impact in oil exporting countries and oil importing countries. So the oil-rich countries are directly affected by this fluctuations. For example, according to some estimates, the region loses nearly $500 million every day from this low prices, which of course is affecting the revenues of oil exporting countries. The oil importing countries, they have spillover effects impacting the remittances, employment, and investment in the region. So next slide, please. We can talk about the impact of COVID-19 on private sectors. So the tourism sector, logistics, transport, retail, wholesale, and construction sector. These are the key sectors, industries that are hit very hardly by the pandemic. Tourism sector, for example, is very important for MENA region because in some countries like Egypt, it's constitutes about 20% of GDP. So it affects the economy, job losses. It affects the well-being of the people. So that's why. So it's actually has been devastated by the pandemic. Logistics sector is another one that has been hit very drastically. Transport, especially transport sector, especially GCC in the GCC countries, being the major transit hubs in the region, the airlines in the GCC, they suffer from low demand due to the pandemic, which caused around like the layoffs close to 20%. For example, Qatar Airways laid off 20% of its workforce. Emirates 30%, and so on to the other countries. So it's also been affected dramatically. The retail, wholesale, and construction sectors are also vulnerable to falling consumer demand. So considering the employers in these sectors are mostly migrant workers, this will affect the migrant workers' income. It will affect remittances that they send to home countries. This will affect their families and so on. So these are the major sectors that have been affected. Please, next slide, please. So to mitigate these effects, the government responded rapidly using fiscal measures and monetary measures. So the fiscal measures include stimulus packages, tax deferrals, tax exemptions, wage subsidies, deferment of debt obligations, support to SMEs, and monetary policy measures include policy rate adjustments, exchange rate adjustments, liquidity injections into financial system. Now, actually, we have several subcategories. Because of the time limitation, I will not be able to go through all of those. But data is available for every country, for every single subcategories on our website. It can be definitely downloaded from the website. But I will talk briefly about one group in the fiscal policy measures, one from the monetary measures. Next slide, please. So, talking about the stimulus packages in the region. So it's fiscal supports in response to COVID-19. So this graph is actually from our data sets that I mean we calculated based on IMF data. So as we can see here, the countries that these packages represent percentage of GDP. So every country has different size of the package, but overall average is in the MENA is 3.8% of GDP, which is significantly lower than the global average. So we can see Qatar is doing extremely well, so a big stimulus package, but the other countries, and there are even some zero supports in for some countries that are not included here. So we can see the global average is at around 11%, but MENA average is 3%, 3.8%. I think the reason for this is that oil importing countries in the region, they're unable to find resources, their own resources, borrowing or taxation. This definitely limit them to offer generous packages. But oil exporting countries is also affected by, they're also affected due to low oil prices. So their package size is also affected. But we definitely see different reactions. Qatar is even above the global average. So it's different. So next slide, please. If you talk about from monetary side, there are different packages. So the policy rate adjustments, policy responses, exchange rate responses, liquidity injection responses were analyzed. This graph shows the liquidity support in response to COVID-19. So again, this also represents the GDP percentage. If you look at the country analyzed, so Bahrain, Oman, now they have higher than the other countries, but MENA region in general is 9.8% of GDP. The global average is 15%. So, but liquidity support basically means the government central bank makes short-term loan to member institutions like local banks to stimulate the economy and stabilize the financial system. And we can see the MENA region is the average 9.7. So if we talk about the expectation, the GDP, of course, we know, as we have already seen the last quarter, the region's economy is expected to contract by 5.7% in 2020. Mr. Izzat, the next slide, please. There should be another slide after this. Yeah, this one. Okay. So we have seen already in the last quarter that there is a negative growth, and it's expected to be 5.7% contract in 2020. Actually, this is the lowest level in last few decades, which is very, very low. Okay, the unemployment is another issue. So according to ILO estimates, 17 million job losses are expected in the entire MENA region. This means mostly expat migrant workers will be affected because the migrant workers account for 40% of all work in the region. So that means job losses for migrants, and that significantly will decrease the remittances flowing from MENA region to those countries, and that will affect the migrants and their families back in the country, and millions of people are expected to be at the risk of extreme poverty, or there will be the increased vulnerability group. Food security is expected to be another issue because the region is highly dependent on food imports. Excuse me, the region may also witness food shortages and food price increases, because if the pandemic disrupts the global food supply chain and production and transportation and distribution, this might affect the prices, and this might cause food shortages, especially in the region, especially in the non-GCC countries. Current account deficit is also, excuse me, the negative current account balance is expected. So it is current account deficit will be around 5%, 5.8% in 2020, and it's expected to be minus 4.8% in 2021. And fiscal deficit also is expected, as we noted. The government's fiscal means basically the government's budget, right? So government has revenue from tax collection and other things, and minus their government spending. So with this COVID-19, we've seen that governments are not able to collect revenues because of tax exemptions, tax deferrals, a big fiscal deficit, and it's expected to be on average 10%, 10.8% in 2020, and 8.9% in 2021. Do we have no? We don't have next slide. So just from this actually shock shows us that the Qatar's economy, not Qatar's, but the region's economy, especially with this decline in oil prices and energy prices and their impact on the entire economy, show that there is need of diversifying economy in the region, and to be able to withstand strongly in the future shocks. And another recommendation is that the government countries should continue supporting SMEs to reduce job layoffs, and to support the economy. And government should also extend tax exceptions, suspending loan repayments, and so on. So with this, I will conclude here and give the floor to Dr. Enis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Özkan. Thank you very much indeed. And yes, we're moving on to Dr. Enis for the final presentation. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My presentation will focus on the social policy responses. So as my colleague mentioned, the goal of the project is to map policy responses in the Gulf and Levant and the Maghreb. So we track and map social policy responses across 9 areas or function, following the framework developed by the ILO. So we looked at the measure within the area of education, food and nutrition, income and job protection, social allowances and care service, maternity and paternity, family and children, pension, and finally civil function, which include different measure covering the previous areas. So overall, we identified 198 responses, social policy responses in the 10 countries. The top announced responses fall within the area of education. The number of measures within this area of education are 54 measures, representing 27% of the total social measures. the top 5 social policy responses, in addition to education, food and nutrition with 33 measures, income and job protection with the 29 measures, civil function covering the different areas with 26 measures, and finally social allowances and grant with 25 measures. The top measure are ICT and digital solution to help with the online education, targeting student and teacher. The second top measure is in-kind food distribution. So overall, as I mentioned, education, government paid more attention to responses within the area of education by 27% of the total responses. Then food and nutrition, representing 17% of the total responses. Income and job protection, 15% of the total measures. Many function, 13%. Allowances, 13% of the total measure. Housing, 8% of the total measure. As you can see, less responses and measure within the area of care service, targeting mothers and fathers, families and children, and pension with 2 to 3% of the total measure. Next slide, please. The top 5 announced measure, as I mentioned, ICT and digital solution with 33 measure within this area in the 10 countries. In-kind food distribution, 23. In-kind assistance, cash transfer and income support. And finally, family cash and in-kind transfer. Next slide, please. So the bottom 5 announced measure, child care, child protection services, social insurance contribution, education service for pregnant women, health insurance and pension for workers in the informal sector. Next slide, please. So now I will give you a brief an overview of the measure within each of the 9 areas. So we start with the first area, education, access to education. So those benefits, so we look to the benefits in cash and in kind provided for the basic education of children. So all the measure, so we look to the different measure within this area, and we as you can see, 67% of the measure within the education fall within or are grouped within ICT and digital solution. Measure such as broadcasting on national TV, broadcasting classes on national TV, remote learning, creating remote learning platforms, creating digital library, campaign on online learning. 22% of the measure within this area are in form of in-kind assistance, providing tablets and laptops for low-income families, financial support for students abroad, providing free mobile internet for families, waiver or exemption of student fees. The 7% of the measure within the education are training teacher on online teaching and technology, and only 4% of the measure goes for research and development. Next slide, please. In the area of food and nutrition, 72% of the measure are in-kind food distribution. 16% are food security or basic measure targeting stock for basic goods and medicine. 60% of the total measure within this area are food price control and food assistance, cash transfer or subsidies for food for household. Next slide, please. In the area of income and job protection, 40% of the measure are in the form of a cash transfer and income support. 28% wage subsidies to employer against layoffs. 20% are employment benefits. and 12% in-kind transfer or voucher for household. Next slide, please. In the area of several function, meaning those measures that concern several functions such as healthcare, access to education, children and family, pension, employment, income, job protection, and food and nutrition, 56% of the measure are related to labor and immigration regulation, mainly in the Gulf area. 28% are in the form of creation or expansion of a fund, solidarity fund, in many countries. 11% are more related to general awareness campaign about the impact of the COVID on health, or the impact of COVID on children or education. And only 5% of the total measure within this area are social insurance contribution. Next slide, please. In the area of social allowances, 37% are support for family in cash and in-kind transfer for families, 25% targeting person with disabilities and elderly, cash and in-kind transfer for this category, vulnerable group, 21% targeting non-citizen, targeting refugees, migrant worker, cash and in-kind transfer, and only 17% of measure in this area target women and girls. Next slide, please. In the area of housing, 33% of the measure are in the form of waiver for rent and housing loans for household, waiver of utility bills for household, 20% rent and housing subsidies, and 20% construction of temporary houses for migrant workers in the Gulf area mainly. Next slide, please. In the area of care service, maternity and parental, 50%, over than 50% of the measure are in form of paid leave for parents, both parents. 23% awareness campaign on the impact of the COVID on pregnant women, on children, on family. 15% are in the form of paid maternity leave, targeting women, pregnant women, or women in general. And only 8% of the measure related to child care. Next slide, please. In the area of families and children, 40% of the measure are in the form of paid sick leave and work from home for pregnant women and sick people. 20% in the form of online education service for pregnant women, child protection services such as online hotline or online services and education and awareness for violence against children. And finally, 20% of the measure cash transfer for families. Next slide, please. In the area of pension, the last area of pension, 80% of the measure are increasing subsidies on contribution for elderly, and only 20% target health insurance, providing health insurance or expanding health insurance and pension for workers in the informal sector. The next slide and the final slide. So what we can see from the data that although most of the government paid more attention to the area of education, providing online platforms and trying to ensure better delivery of classes and helping with in-kind food distribution. However, what we can recommend based on the data collected, based on the gap identified in the tracker, that there is a need to expand Social Security and insurance, mainly insurance and pension coverage for informal workers. I mean, we learn from the research and many other databases that 70% of the population, I mean, we can say over than 50% of the worker in the MENA region work in the informal sector, with limited, or let's say absent, social security and no access to pension. So we recommend that government to consider expanding the social security coverage to informal workers, increase access to elderly, to women and people with disability, to services. And we saw in the data that less announced measure targeting people with disability, children, adolescent, and youth. We could identify any announced measure specifically targeting adolescent and youth mental health, for example. Another gap, which is support service for women and girls to basic service, including health, including education, protection from violence, and employment, and financial support. And we know from many reports that 70% of working women in the whole region, in the Arab region, work in the informal sector without any legal or social protection. Another area which we think, based on the data we collected, need more attention is providing social care system for the elderly and person with disability. And finally, more attention to refugees and migrant workers, and ensuring access, ensuring that these two vulnerable categories, refugees and migrant worker, have access to social protection measure. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Anis. Thank you so much. We are basically already done with the time. I would just like to take a couple of minutes. There are a few interesting additional questions in the Q&A. And one is to Dr. Anis, question about disaggregated data on age groups, particularly older people. Is that something we can do?
Well, I mean, the goal of the project is to map announced measure, announced in the news, announced in government websites. Getting disaggregated data in the MENA region, has been always a challenge. Mainly disaggregate in terms of age or gender. Maybe I will have a look, but as I said, I mean, the main goal of this project is to map what already exists, what already announced by the government in terms of policies. We don't have data in this project. We don't have disaggregated by age, and as I mentioned, only very few measure target specifically elderly. Most of the measures target household in general, or the family, assuming that the family will take care of other members.
And another question for you is about mental health, or for me actually, it's a question that includes public health and social protections. Anis, you want to go first, and then I can also briefly respond. What about mental health impacts and mental health measures?
No, I mean, one comment that, of course, there are many overlaps. So some of the policy we classify them as health, but they are targeting social groups, targeting young people. In the social area, in the measure, we classify them as social policies. We couldn't identify measure folks on mental health for parents, for women, for children. I remember only Morocco announced support service for pregnant women, for children. As I said, I mean, the challenge of this tracker is the data accessibility, and so we are limited by the announced measure. I'm sure there are many existing measures. I know that in Qatar, for example, there are the Qatar Foundation for Social Work announced different service, improved existing services targeting mental health, the public health. The Minister of Public Health in Qatar announced it, and Sidra announced it also, and they have already existing services for mental health.
Yes, thank you. And if I can add to that, there is indeed a gap here globally speaking, because that area of mental health was originally not really within the mandate of the WHO. So this is a typical area in international organization where actually a policy field that is super important has to be added. Actually, that has to be done by some sort of a consensus if it is to become a standard protocol for international organizations. That's a little bit of a political problem sometimes. However, actually, there is a new term which is probably more accurate to use, which is population than public health, right? Because traditionally, for that reason, that the recognition of mental health as being as important as physical health and well-being is, and it was for a long time, as we all know, also in some regions of the world more than others, stigmatized, right? And so that is why there are some gaps in data. There are some gaps even in the academic literature of public health measures. Now, the more recent field of population health, both in terms of from the medical sciences and the policy sciences, is bridging this gap. And so going forward, we will definitely like to see this more addressed. But it's...
If you allow me, because Susan... Yes. Yeah, Susan, I think, asked a question about policy targeting elderly. There are, I mean, in the area of social allowances, there are 25% of the measure within the social areas target persons with disabilities and elderly. So there are some measures, mainly cash and in-kind transfer for elderly and disability. But as I mentioned in my presentation, social allowances and mainly policies targeting vulnerable group, government paid less attention to those groups compared to education or food subsidies or food distribution. Maybe because of and we know from many other research that, again, like women, like working in the informal sector, elderly and people with disability in many Arab countries, with exception of some of the Gulf countries, face similar challenge: lack of coverage, lack of health insurance, lack of pension. And as I mentioned, and this is because of the history and the structural issue with the labor market in most of the Arab countries, that most of the worker work in the informal sector with, as I said, no health insurance, no pension. I think this is one of the explanations why we saw less policies targeting elderly. Less government responses. Of course, we know in the MENA region the important role of the civil society, of the family, as an informal social protection for elderly and people with disability.
Thank you. Yes. So the final question here is about the measures across MENA, whether we can see significant differences in the pandemic responses of countries, or whether they're more or less the same. If I may summarize, yes, of course, there are those differences and the variations. First of all, the greatest differences are basically to be seen in the economic and in the social field. Unfortunately, I think when I was talking about public health, somehow there was a gap in the internet connection. And so, but what I was getting at toward the end is that because this is all a global script about flattening the curve, that's what most countries are doing. That's not actually the gold standard. This is buying time. This is making sure that the healthcare system is not overwhelmed. This prevents more fatality, etc., etc. The gold standard actually is becoming in control, controlling the pandemic, which is very, very hard to do in this case for known reasons. And so basically, some of the measures in some of the countries have been more rigorous and more stringent with regard to the public health field. Earlier on, more comprehensive packages and a little bit less or a little bit more timid, so to speak, in other cases. So we do see these variations in the public health field. However, if we take all the measures together, they are fairly similar, but they do vary in terms of the comprehensiveness, the intensity, and when they were taken, or if they are taken again as soon as needed. More variations, as we have seen from my colleagues, Dr. Özkan and Dr. Anis, in those economic and social areas. Well, I would like to basically come to a conclusion, but I would like to thank all the speakers very, very cordially, thank our MC, Mr. Ezzedine, and of course, thank you